He was already out of the grave. That's the part nobody talks about. Jesus had already called his name. The stone was already rolled away. Lazarus had already walked out into the light, breathing, blinking, standing upright in front of everyone who had spent 4 days grieving him. And then Jesus said something that doesn't make sense if this is just a miracle story. He said, "Unbind him." Why would a man who just conquered death still need help? Why would someone who had literally been raised from the dead still be wrapped in the clothes of a corpse? Because resurrection and freedom, it turns out, are two completely different things. You can be brought back to life and still be dressed for the tomb. You can have a new beginning and still be carrying the weight of an old ending. You can be chosen, called, transformed in your spirit, and still walking around in grave clothes. And here's a question that I haven't been able to shake. What if the thing holding you back right now isn't the enemy? What if it's not your past, your trauma, your failures? What if the thing holding you back is that some part of you doesn't actually want to be unbound? There's a kind of comfort in brokenness that nobody likes to admit out loud. Not the kind of comfort that feels good, that kind of feels familiar. The kind that has its own gravity, its own logic, its own language that you've been speaking so long you forgot it was even a language. You know what I mean. The relationship that keeps ending and starting again because at least you know how it ends. The version of yourself that shrinks in rooms because staying small means you never have to risk being seen and found wanting. The drinking, the scrolling, the overworking, the undersleeping, not because these things make life better, but because they are unknown quantity. And the known, even when it's terrible, is less terrifying than the unknown. There's a psychological term for this. They call it a comfort zone, but that phrase has always felt too soft to me, too much like a hammock. It's not a comfort zone, it's a known zone, and the known zone can be a prison cell you've decorated. Therapists have been writing about this for decades, the idea that people will often choose familiar pain over unfamiliar peace, that there is something in the human psyche that would rather suffer in a predictable way than risk thriving in an unpredictable one. And before you dismiss that, think about the last time someone offered you something genuinely good. A new opportunity, a real apology, a relationship that didn't feel like walking on glass, a version of yourself that was actually healthy. Did you lean in, or did you find a reason to pull back? Did you take the open door, or did you spend 3 weeks convincing yourself it wasn't really open? I'm not asking that to shame you. I'm asking because I think most of us have a story, maybe several stories, where the miracle was standing right in front of us, and we found a sophisticated, well-reasoned, even spiritual way to stay in the tomb. And that's what this story is actually about. John chapter 11. Lazarus is sick. His sisters, Mary and Martha, send a word to Jesus, the man who presumably could fix this, and Jesus doesn't come. He waits. 2 days he waits, and by the time he arrives, Lazarus has been dead and buried for 4 full days. Martha runs out to meet him on the road and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." That sentence carries more than grief. It carries the particular kind of pain that comes from unanswered prayer, from calling out to someone you trusted and hearing nothing back, from watching the thing you feared happen anyway. Jesus weeps. That's the shortest verse in all of Scripture. Jesus wept. 2 words, and they're doing an enormous amount of work. Then they go to the tomb. Jesus calls into the darkness, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus comes out, still wrapped head to foot in burial cloth, his face covered with a linen cloth. And Jesus says, "Unbind him and let him go." Now here is what most of us were never taught. In the Jewish burial tradition of 1st century Palestine, the dead were not wrapped loosely. The body was bound tightly with linen strips, and spices were packed into the wrappings to slow decomposition. The face was covered with a separate cloth called a sudarium. This wasn't a casual draping. This was a process that took time, that involved the whole community, that was layered and deliberate.
Lazarus didn't just have a burial shroud on, he was, in the most literal sense, wrapped in the full identity of death. Here is the second thing. The Greek word used when Jesus calls Lazarus out, the word come forth, is the same imperative form used in Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, when God speaks creation into existence. Let there be light. Same grammatical force, same commanding register. Jesus isn't asking, he's creating. And the third thing, and this is the one that undoes me, is that after 4 days in a tomb in a Middle Eastern climate, this man should have been unrecognizable. The crowd would have known that. They would have smelled. When Jesus says, take away the stone, Martha's response is immediate and visceral. Lord, there will be an odor. She's not being dramatic, she's being honest. Everyone present knew that what was inside that tomb was beyond help. And Jesus called into it anyway.
We think this is a story about a miracle. It's not. It's a story about what happens after the miracle. We think this is a story about death being defeated, and yes, of course, that's here. We think it's about the power of Jesus, about faith, about Martha's confession that he is the resurrection and the life. All of that is real. All of that matters. But if that's where the story ends for you, you have stopped reading too soon. Because after every other miracle Jesus performs in the Gospels, the person just lives. The blind man sees, the lame man walks, the healed go home. The story ends at the miracle. But here, after the greatest, most staggering miracle in the entire pre-resurrection gospel narrative, Jesus does something he doesn't do anywhere else. He stops, he turns to the people standing there, and he gives them an instruction. Unbind him. He doesn't do it himself. He could have. He just raised a man from the dead with his voice alone. But he doesn't unbind Lazarus. He tells the people around him to do it. Why? For a long time, I read that as a practical detail. Like, obviously someone needs to unwrap him. He can't do it himself. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I think Jesus is making a theological statement that the church has been uncomfortable with for centuries. The resurrection is the act of God. The unwrapping is the work of community. And the willingness to be unwrapped, to stand there and let people undo what death tied on you, that part belongs to Lazarus. Because notice, Jesus doesn't say, Lazarus, unbind yourself. He doesn't look at the crowd and say, I'll handle this part too. He creates a moment intentionally where the resurrected man has to receive help, has to be seen, has to allow people close enough to touch the thing that still smells like a tomb. That is not a logistical footnote. That is the architecture of transformation.
Now let's go somewhere harder. What did it feel like for Lazarus to walk out of that tomb? We always imagine it as triumphant. We imagine the crowd cheering, the sisters weeping with joy, the sun breaking through after 4 days of grief. And maybe that's part of it, but Lazarus had been dead. Not metaphorically dead, not emotionally numb, not spiritually dry, actually biologically, certifiably dead for 4 days. And whatever he experienced in those 4 days, whatever is on the other side, he was pulled back from it. Pulled back into a body that was starting to decay. Pulled back into a world that had already started grieving him, organizing without him, adjusting to his absence. He came back to a world that had already begun to move on. And here's the uncomfortable theological reality that most resurrection sermons skip entirely. Resurrection is disorienting. There is a reason the Greek word for resurrection, anastasis, literally means a standing up again. Not a continuation, not picking up where you left off, a standing up again. Which implies you were down, which implies the posture is entirely different, which implies that the new standing is not the same as the old standing. Lazarus came back, but he didn't come back to the same life. His body had decomposed, his community had buried him, his sisters had moved into grief. Everything had reorganized itself around his absence. And now he had to walk back into a world that had adjusted to living without him, still wrapped in the clothes they put on a dead man.
I want you to sit with that image for a moment because I think it is the most precise picture of what it feels like to be genuinely changed by God and still not know what to do with it. You're out of the tomb, the miracle happened, something real and deep and irreversible has shifted in you, but the old language is still on your body. The old story people told about you is still circulating. The old version of you that everyone organized themselves around, that's still the default setting in every room you walk into. And the question is not whether you've been resurrected. The question is whether you will let yourself be unbound.
You are the person that I've been building toward. The part I've been building toward. Some of you don't want to be unbound. Not because you don't believe in transformation, not because you haven't prayed for it, not because you doubt that God can do it, but because the grave clothes are the last thing you have. Stay with me. The grave clothes, the old self, the old story, the old way of being, they come with something that freedom doesn't immediately offer. They come with an explanation. When you're still wrapped in the familiar dysfunction, you have a reason for where you are. The trauma explains the drinking. The upbringing explains the pattern. The wound explains the wall. The story of what happened to you is the most defensible thing you own. And somewhere, quietly, you have learned to hold it in front of you like a shield. And I am not saying that story isn't true. I'm not saying the wound isn't real. I'm not saying what happened to you didn't matter. I'm saying you are using it to stay in the tomb. Because if Lazarus walks out fully unbound, if you walk out fully unbound, then you lose the excuse. You gain the possibility, yes, but you lose the story that justified the standstill. You become responsible for what you do next, and that is terrifying in a way that grief never is. Grief is passive. Freedom is active. Grief has a direction, down. Freedom has a direction, forward. And forward means choosing, deciding, failing, trying, being seen, falling short, getting up. Forward means you can no longer say, I would have, but. Forward means you have to become the new thing fully and let the old thing die. Actually die, not keep it in a box in the corner of your identity where you can pull it out when you need an explanation. Most people experience God's touch and then spend years negotiating with the grave clothes, keeping just this part, holding on to just that piece. I've been transformed, but I'm still not ready to, and then trailing off into the most comfortable sentence they know. Jesus is not interested in partial unwrapping. He didn't call Lazarus his main so he could be mostly out of the tomb. And here, standing at the edge of that discomfort is where most of us quietly decide to stop reading. Let me get specific, because this is where it needs to land. You have a relationship, maybe a friendship, maybe a family dynamic, maybe a romantic history that you know is not good for you. Not in the dramatic way, not in the way that anyone watching from the outside will describe as a crisis, just in the quiet way, where you always feel slightly less like yourself afterward, where you walk away a little smaller, a little more confused, a little more willing to accept less than you actually deserve. And you keep going back. Not because you don't know better, you do know better, but because the alternative, the open space, the unfamiliar territory of a life that doesn't have that person's voice filling the silence, that space is too quiet. And too quiet sounds a lot like loneliness, and loneliness sounds a lot like a tomb. So you rewrap. Or, and this one is more subtle, you've had a genuine encounter with God. A real moment of change, a real come forth in your own life. And for a few weeks or months, you lived differently. You were lighter. You prayed like you meant it. You were honest in ways that surprised even you. And then, slowly, the old vocabulary crept back in. The old habits reasserted themselves. Now with drama, with quiet, with the slow gravitational pull of what is known. And you started explaining it with language that sounds spiritual. I'm just in a dry season. I'm processing. God's not done with me yet. All of which may be true, but which can also be the most polished version of staying wrapped in grave clothes that I have ever heard.
I've been here too. I have sat with a real word from God, a real moment of change, a real come forth in my own life, and found 1,000 intelligent reasons why now wasn't quite the right moment to be unbound. I've been very articulate about my tomb. And the thing I've learned, slowly, reluctantly, is that the community Jesus appoints to unbind us is rarely the one we would have chosen. It's not always comfortable people. It's not always people who ask permission before they start pulling. Sometimes the unwrapping is the hardest part of the miracle, because it requires you to stand still and let someone see what death looked like on you. That means therapy you didn't think you needed, conversations you've been postponing for 2 years, a community you've been circling but never actually entering, a commitment you've been evaluating for so long that evaluating it has become its own identity. The call has already been given. Your name has already been spoken. The only question left is whether you will walk toward the people God has placed at the entrance of the tomb and let them do what Jesus asked them to do.
I want to slow down here. Not to make another point, not to land another argument, just to be honest with you about something. There is a version of this passage where Lazarus is the hero. He hears his name and he comes out, bold, decisive, faithful. And that reading is not wrong, but there is another version, and I think it's the more honest one, where Lazarus is terrified, where the first thing he feels standing in the light after 4 days in darkness is not triumph, but confusion, where the grave clothes feel like the only solid thing in a world that has suddenly become incomprehensible, where the crowd and the noise and the weeping and the light are all too much at once, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, he has to make a choice about whether he's going to let go of the last thing that still makes sense. And Jesus is patient. He doesn't rush him. He doesn't say, "I just raised you from the dead, so get it together." He turns to the community and says, quietly, practically, with full knowledge of how long this will take, unbind him. There is no urgency in that sentence. There is no disappointment. There is only the next step given clearly to people who are capable of taking it. And I think that's the invitation today. Not to have it all figured out, not to perform a transformation you haven't actually finished living, not to pretend the grave clothes aren't still there, just to stand in front of God right now, in whatever condition you're actually in, and say, "I came out of the tomb, I heard my name, I'm out here, but I'm still wrapped in some things I don't know how to take off myself, and I think I need help." That's it. That's the whole prayer. Because the God who called you out of the darkest thing you've ever been through is not surprised by the wrappings. He already accounted for them.
This week, one thing. Identify one grave cloth. Not all of them, not the whole inventory. One story you keep telling about yourself that keeps you in the posture of the buried. One relationship, one habit, one inner monologue that still speaks in the language of someone who is not supposed to be alive. Name it, not to shame yourself, just to see it clearly. And then ask God, and ask one trusted person in your life to help you begin the unbinding. Because here is the thing about Lazarus that we never talk about at funerals or Easter services or in the triumphant version of this story. He walked out of that tomb still needing people. He was raised by God and unwrapped by humans. And that is not a design flaw. That is the design. You were not called out of death so you could carry the evidence of it forever. This week, one thing. Identify one grave cloth. Not all of them, not the whole inventory. One story you keep telling about yourself that keeps you in the posture of the buried. One relationship, one habit, one inner monologue that still speaks in the language of someone who is not supposed to be alive. Name it, not to shame yourself, just to see it clearly. And then ask God, and ask one trusted person in your life to help you begin the unbinding. Because here is the thing about Lazarus that we never talk about at funerals or Easter services or in the triumphant version of this story. He walked out of that tomb still needing people. He was raised by God and unwrapped by humans. And that is not a design flaw. That is the design. You were not called out of death so you could carry the evidence of it forever. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this story impacted your Christian journey in the comment section below. Please like and subscribe so the algorithm will reach someone like you who needs commentary, stories like this.